Bonsoir et bienvenue. Good evening and welcome. Mon nom est Ingrid Bachmann, je suis professeure dans le département des arts plastiques à l'Université de Concordia. Il me fait énormément plaisir de vous accueillir à cet événement dans la série d'artistes invités Conversations en art contemporain. My name is Ingrid Bachmann. I'm a professor in the Studio Arts MFA program at Concordia University. It gives me great pleasure to see all of you here tonight and to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Azra Akšamija. This, as you know, is a bi-monthly lecture series. We'll have our last lecture in 2 weeks' time here, and we hope we'll see you there. I'd now like to introduce Professor Kelly Thompson from Fibers and Material Studies, who will do the formal introduction of Azra.
Hello. It's a great pleasure to introduce Azra. She is has the position of Class of 1922 Career Development Professor and Assistant Professor in the Art, Culture and Teaching Technology program at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I've just asked what the class of 1922 is, and it is an endowed chair, so it's a very significant position to have at MIT. Akšamija holds a graduate degrees in architecture from the Technical Institute in Graz, Austria, and also Princeton University, and received her Ph.D. from MIT in 2011. Bridging art, architecture, and history, her work investigates politics of representation of Islam in the West, spatial mediations of identity and cultural transfers. Her work has been shown at the Generali Foundation Vienna, Sculpture Center New York, the Secession Vienna, Royal Academy of Arts in London, and the Fondazione Giorgio Cini within the 54th Biennale in Venice. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, and welcome.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Kelly, for the invitation and for hosting me here. Thank you all for coming tonight. I will be talking around 1 hour, I hope, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers, and I hope it will be a lively discussion. As Kelly said, my work is informed from my disciplinary background, which is architecture and architecture history, but since 12 years I had a parallel life as an artist, and basically the academic research informs my artistic practice and vice versa. The art feeds back into the writing, and then try to combine the two as much as I can. The title of my lecture is Vehicles for Cultural Mediation. I'm calling it as a kind of umbrella term for a range of works that I produced over the course of the past decade that are about finding ways to meaningfully bridge cultures, express cultural diversities, and provide tools for interventions in conflicts that are religiously, politically, culturally motivated. So my work is located at this intersection between art, architecture, and history, and over the course of years, I have developed different approaches, 2 of which I will be showing today. One is the restorative memory approach, and the other cultural pedagogy. Cultural pedagogy projects are about creating possibilities of cultural encounters, exchanges, and transfers in forms of wearable artwork and portable installations on human scale mainly. And the restorative memory projects examine how collective memory and fragments of memory could be recovered in a kind of constructive way to intervene at politics of memory and conflicts over memory and identity today. I work on different scales, global, civic, body scale. Often the projects take very complex forms in which all these different scales are integrated. So let me begin with the restorative memory approach, and the most recent work, or the work that I'm currently working on. I would like to begin with a little story from Sarajevo, the city where I come from. It is October 4, 2012. Dozens of protesters, students, citizens of Sarajevo gathered in front of the entrance of the National Museum in Bosnia and Herzegovina, witnessing what has already become a historical event. The doors of the museum are to be locked and nailed with wooden panels as if expecting a tornado. Zatvoreno, or closed, reads the inscription on the panels crossing out the doors. These handwritten letters make it clear. The National Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina has been closed to public, and this for the first time in the 125 years of existence. And this depressing image of the closed cultural institution in Bosnia reflects a society that is still coming to terms with the consequences of the war, and in which systematic destruction of cultural heritage and also genocide were means to divide society, erase and revise its collective memory of coexistence. So I will be showing now a couple of slides that just put this work that is coming later in context. I have been working with colleagues and people from different disciplines about addressing this crisis, acute crisis of cultural institutions. Just briefly, this is where Bosnia and Herzegovina is. Oops. Yeah, let me just move my mouse so I can see it. Well, okay, I don't see this. So, in the heart of Europe, it has historically been a place, you see it really as a crossroads of East and West, different civilizations and cultures. And as you can see in this slide, I mean, this long history of coexistence where different religions, nations met and coexisted has been embodied in its very rich cultural heritage and also architecture that we really witnesses, like these mosque and the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, in a close proximity to one another, that history of coexistence. The fact that these buildings existed for centuries next to one another says really a lot, that these people, you know, maybe history was not always peaceful, but they managed to live side by side for centuries. After the worship, people would meet on this square, hang out, exchange. There was a lot of also intermixed marriages, the language was mixed, and so on. And precisely this history of coexistence stood in the way of nationalist purification and the revision of that history towards a kind of separation of Bosnia and Herzegovina into different ethnically clean entities that were to become either parts of Greater Serbia or Greater Croatia, and to fit in different versions of grand nationalist projects. And hence the cultural heritage you know, that witnessed this coexistence had to be erased and attacked to kind of erase that memory of coexistence. So you see here the targeted shelling of the old bridge in Mostar, which was really the symbol of coexistence, a pearl of Ottoman architecture from the 16th century that connected two parts of the city, and that was destroyed in 1993. Religious architecture was, precisely because it is the most poignant symbol of ethnic and national identity in public space, was you know, specifically a target. And so people who were identified, so to say, as enemies had to be erased, and also traces of their existence were attacked. So over 3,300 religious monuments were destroyed in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Symbols of all ethnic groups were affected to different extents, though. Around 1,200 mosques were destroyed, and approximately 200 churches predominantly Catholic ones. The program of ethnic cleansing that was undertaken through a mass murder and forced expulsion of people and eradication of their material traces was undertaken in a twofold strategy. One was to really expel people from their homes and kill them, put them in concentration camps. There was torture, mass rape, and killing that would forever, so to say, extinguish the desire for coexistence after you have been tortured so much and had your family killed in front of your eyes. You know, why would you ever want to live together? Those who survived were basically kicked out of their villages and homes. And here an image from the refugees from Srebrenica, the genocide that is acknowledged so far, but there were many other killings that were not yet recognized as a genocide. So the other part of that strategy of ethnic cleansing was to, you know, next to the traumatizing and antagonizing particular populations within multi-ethnic enclaves to extinguish their desire for coexistence, was also to annihilate all material traces of their coexistence, and that would prove, so to say, their historical claims to land. So here you see the burning of the National Library Vijećnica in Sarajevo in 1992 from the position of the Serb forces controlled Yugoslav army that was sieging the city of Sarajevo for years, targeting the library in a precise incendiary grenades. When people built human chains to rescue books that were burning, they were shot by snipers so that firefighting operations could not be conducted. And this was called by historian Andras Riedelmeier the largest single incident of book burning in modern history. The significance of this library is that this was the main university library, the National Library, and also it contained, this one, but also, for example, the Oriental Archive of the Oriental Institute and many other archives that were shelled, contained different documents that from the 19th century, land relationships, ownerships of land, who was where, and basically you can kind of destroying these documents, you destroy also evidence of who lived where for how long and so on. So in '95 the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed, and this country was divided into two political entities, the Serb Republic and the Federation of Bosniaks and Croats. And what is very interesting is that this kind of compromise made for the peace really, in fact, legitimized ethnic cleansing and genocide and a kind of this separation of ethnic life in the country. And you see here maps from Bosnia before and after the war. So this is before the war. You have a demographic map with a patchwork of people living really scattered all across and not really more than 50% of majority of one ethnic group in one region. And then in this, after the war, neatly separated ethnic majorities, which then became these, so to say, political entities, Republic Srpska and Bosniak Croat Federation. And so, of course, you know, this is an enforced condition, which then perpetuated the war after the conflict and kind of fighting has stopped. But you have a continuation of conflict happening and perpetuating itself in the cultural sphere through a battle of religious symbols and ethno-national demarcation of territories, showing who has dominance over what territory, who has returned to what territory, who is now new boss in what territory, and so on. And in many cases, in the process of restoration of religious architecture, you know, people will hurry up and kind of until the Department for Conservation doesn't get a hold of a restoration process, they will hurry up and rebuild a church tower or a minaret, tripling the height of it, just to really show that they are back, and or that they are the new boss in that city. So this has many different reasons. There is nationalism going on. There is also a kind of a resurgence of religion after the communism, but so different processes are negotiated in religious architecture. But the point I want to make here is really that the war is still going on with different means. And part of that conflict is taking effect also in the way cultural institutions are dealt with, that are, so to say, institutions from the previous system that was a socialist Yugoslavia. And it had different archives, libraries, national galleries, and so on. And when Bosnia and Herzegovina became a country, these institutions were supposed to become a kind of state institutions. But then in Bosnia now you have half of the country saying, well, actually, this is not my national museum because I want to have my own national museum. I don't want to live with you guys anymore. Or this is not my history. I'm not sufficiently represented in this museum. So of course these institutions, and 7 of them, these are major state-level institutions, National Museum, National University Library, National Gallery, Cinematic Archive, for example. These are all affected by acute crisis, and the National Museum has closed. The gallery has been closed a couple of times, but reopened. They are struggling to find reasons for their existence. And so, reacting to this acute crisis, I co-initiated a platform called Culture Shutdown, inviting scholars, artists, activists, people from different ethnic, religious backgrounds, disciplinary backgrounds, not also from the region, but people in the United States, or also in Canada we have members, to unite forces and start also raising awareness, but also researching what is actually behind this crisis. So what we found out was that this whole discussion about there's no budget for this museum is in fact a political discussion, that these institutions have never been legally defined, meaning that the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina never said, yes, this is my state archive, this is my national museum, or no, it's not. They just exist physically from the previous system, but they have no legal status. Meaning when a director of one museum goes to retire, there is no legal body to appoint them. So no one feels responsible to give them funding, to develop some program, to do some kind of development. And so this was, I think, a major shift that our platform contributed to move the discussion from we have no budget and who cares about this museum, to say, well, actually, it is a question of a state and state institutions. What institutions do we need? In March of this year, I organized the Global Solidarity Day, calling out museums and galleries worldwide to, with this yellow barricade tape that is a kind of logo of our platform, cross out one artifact in their collection for one day, take a picture of that and send me the picture as a sign of solidarity with these Bosnian institutions. And so this was quite an insane action. First, I was like sending to friends and gallerists who I knew will probably participate, and I thought if I get 30 institutions to participate, this will be wonderful success. But then first images started coming in, and this was really wonderful what people started to cross out, and kind of sympathy and empathy that we managed to create all across the globe with these institutions. So this is from Germany, from Italy, from Croatia, also some countries that couldn't get the tape in a right amount of time because the action was growing radically. I told them to participate also with their website. So So they would cross out parts of their website, for example. So the action went viral and global. Over 390 institutions globally, or in 40 countries on all continents, participated. And it was really touching and moving to see also what all is heritage, and what would you, so to say, feel if you wouldn't have access to one artifact that is really important to your national cultural history. What was also very wonderful is that our neighboring countries like Serbia, Croatia participated to a really huge extent, and I had difficulties finding support from local institutions in Bosnia because of these different political struggles, but so to say the neighboring countries with whom we also had a war participated because they are kind of suffering from similar issues. And in Belgrade, the Contemporary Art Museum has been closed for, I think, 10 years now. In Croatia, over 50 institutions participated. And so after the action, and it was a very important signal for the nationalists in Bosnia and Herzegovina to say, okay, actually, you know, it is a precious cultural heritage that you have there, and we need to think about it. So after this action, I commissioned a local graphic designer in Bosnia to produce banners for me, to post them and make an exhibition of these posters on the facades of the institutions, and they are still displayed there. So when tourists come to Bosnia, they will see these and start asking questions of, you know, what is happening with these institutions. What I'm currently working on is a series of workshops that will take place in different countries, because this is also a global issue. There's a global crisis of the museum, of culture, access to heritage, but also specifically from the activist perspective, what matters for Bosnia is a kind of conversation of we are the state. Who is the state? Who is responsible for these institutions? To induce a kind of dialogue about a collective state through discussion of cultural institutions. So part of that work also informs my, so to say, the activist stuff informs the artistic work, and I call it a museum solidarity lobby. It is a kind of new cultural practice that is collective, that is nomadic. This is an installation, currently a display in the Contemporary Art Museum in Ljubljana. So where I crossed out the entrance to the museum, but it's both a barricade and display, and barricade is like this. So you can actually enter in here. Underneath of this, as you walk in, you hear sound, and the sound is interviews that I conduct with different cultural producers in different places where this installation is traveling, about also their problem with access to heritage. And you know, currently in Slovenia they have kind of consolidation of budgets and different ministries that is affecting also closing of museums. In the interiors of museums, I create this kind of lobby, a parallel lobby, both are like a physical lobby. These are sound chairs made of recycled shipping crates. You can sit in them and you can listen to these interviews. The interviews are what I call the future heritage collection. So this is really now opening up bigger questions of what is heritage, who decides, how do we negotiate this? Heritage really is about negotiation, and kind of deciding collectively how do we define, how we take heritage to define notions of governance. And so this is a project that I'm currently working on, and I would like to invite you also to maybe after the lecture fill out some of these cards. So here I am staged as an archaeologist coming from the future, a time traveler, and asking people at our present different questions about heritage. There are 10 different scenarios. I will play a video that shows some of these questions. They are based on real life problems. Dear citizen of the world, 100 years from your present, humankind has finally established contact with another planet. Humans are about to send a spacecraft with documentation about heritage representing or embodying the cultural memory of our world. Through time travel, I have arrived to include your voice in this selection process. As the Earth's representative inhabitant, you have the right to select one example of cultural heritage. Can you tell me what would you pick and why? Please send me your proposal by sending out this card. Thank you. Dear citizen of the world, your government is about to launch a nation branding campaign by inviting citizens to discuss their national heritage. The government plans to create a Twitter account named @HeritageOfMyCountry, curated weekly by a randomly chosen citizen. The goal of this rotating curatorship is to improve the image of your country through definitions of heritage that are literally controlled by its citizens. You will be in charge of this account for 1 week. What example of heritage would you choose in order to improve your country and why? Please help your government by filling out this card. Thank you.
Okay, one more.
Dear citizen of the world, the United Nations General Assembly is planning to revise the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the next 5 years. The goal is to promote appreciation of cultural heritage as a human right for all cultural groups in your country and ensure access to such culture by all. Can you help identify one example of cultural heritage in your country that is not accessible to all groups? And please explain why is it so. Please help them with your insights and personal experience. Thank you.
So this, you can see I had a lot of fun dressing up, taking on different roles. So there are different issues being spoken about here, from digitalization of data and then not being able to access that knowledge at some time. Also, how do we see ourselves in 1,000 years? Who will care about heritage? And because definitions of heritage are something that is quite a modern phenomenon. And in earlier times, people had no problem of recycling some Roman temple and building a house out of it. So these are universal questions that are really touching the nerve of different places, and that's why I think also so many institutions participated in this Solidarity Day. Otherwise, really, I was so surprised to see, why would someone in Australia care about some museum in Bosnia? I mean, what is the connection? Still, most of my work is dedicated to the work in Bosnia. My PhD research was about destruction of religious architecture in Bosnia and transformation of Bosnian Muslims' identity. I studied Islamic architecture history, hence that was the focus. And the kind of quest for national identity and religious identity that happened with Bosnian Muslims after the war in response to destructions and genocide that they were victim of. So this is a project called Monument in Waiting. It's a carpet hand woven by victims of war, and the pattern is a kind of transformed pattern of traditional Bosnian iconography into a pattern that tells a story. So let me give you a little bit of background to this. I looked specifically at this systematic destruction of mosque architecture. As I said earlier, 1,200, which is 70%, of Islamic architecture has been destroyed. Destructions were systematic and deliberate, and it has been continuously proven, and part of my work was really to also provide arguments that architecture was in fact instrumental part of war and ethnic cleansing. So, for example, the way buildings were destroyed, and this is the also very important building Alaja Mosque in Foča from 16th century. All mosques in the city were destroyed. Oftentimes, buildings were being, first like plundered, burned, shelled. Then a bulldozer would come and like kind of erase everything. In this case, even foundation stones were dug out so that you cannot rebuild from the original. And then there was a lot of effort involved in this, that then foundation stones would be carried to unknown location so that you also cannot find them. And in this case, they were carried away to a nearby river and mixed with the bones of a mass grave on top of which they were placed. There's something really touching and kind of horrible also about this, like mixing stones and bones, and oftentimes also garbage, as all of this would be part of the same pile. And so part of my argument in my dissertation was that the kind of sadism on architecture that's not just went beyond the mere I'm shooting your church or you shoot my mosque, but really torturing architecture, torturing people in front of architecture on significant religious holidays, and that sadism led to was so strong. The violence produced the mosque as a place where new types of identity constructions are happening. It's not just a mere religious space anymore where a community goes to worship. It is also a place where politics are negotiated, where trauma recovery is happening, where missionarism of global Islamic forces is coming in. So many different things are happening in that space. And so in my field work, and all of this informs the design of this carpet, I visited around 200 mosques and interviewed people who are rebuilding, returnees, also architects, people from the Islamic religious organizations, people who are channeling donations, humanitarian organizations investigating this process. I also conducted archival research and received a database from historian Azra Akšamija, who was one of the Hague Tribunal criminal for the criminal tribunal in the Hague, expert witnesses in many cases, and so building also on his work, and also gathering photographic material that proves that building was there before. This is how it looks now. So it's kind of forensics of architecture that is being done to prove also that oftentimes people will claim, well, there was never a mosque or a church there. So with the photographs you can actually prove these things. And then there was field work also involved with and interviews with kind of people who survived many wars in these villages, like this imam here, who told also story about the repeated destructions and renovations. In each place that I visited, I left prayer beads of myself and took prayer beads from the community. It was about exchanging traces. I will show you later where I used these prayer beads. For me, they were important as a kind of embodied memory of worshippers who were using them for their prayers, and they kind of went through many hands. The pattern was designed in collaboration and with feedback of the weavers. It was a killing weaving workshop in Sarajevo that also employs women who suffered horrible traumas in rape camps and were kind of employed here for recovery. And in that sense, the weaving functions also as a trauma recovery process, so the very making of this. But also the pattern can be means of storytelling. So inspirations here come both from the local culture, like this carpet. This is a typical pattern that you have in Sarajevo, and this other on the left, these are Afghan war rugs, carpets that really depict violence that has become the everyday life in Afghanistan after decades of wars and violence, that they have infiltrated really the material culture in that region. And so in the context of my carpet, I transformed the so-called diamond pattern that is typical for the Bosnian carpet into this threefold pattern. So these are grenades, landmines, and barbed wires that stand for concentration camps. The tree itself is coded, so you have a kind of trunk, three branches, leaves that are sometimes painted white, sometimes left out, and then on the end of the branches are these birds. So in order to read the carpet, you also have to have, there's a video and booklets that kind of give deeper information about what is being told. But this is a kind of structure of it. So the birds tell the story. There is devastation, intensity marked by the degree of these leaves, and then also the means of reconstruction, whether they have changed something or not. In many cases, people just rebuilt a completely different structure and, so to say, reinvent the identity. At the end of the branches are birds. Birds in traditional carpet iconography are carriers of souls from this world to the world after, but they are also carriers of messages. So in this carpet, there are nine stories presented. This is, for example, a bird that is telling a more kind of historic story about a woman who was kidnapped during the Austro-Hungarian raid of the city and was brought to Budapest, and every night she would dream of a sheikh, like an Islamic mystic, appearing in her dream, and she was homesick, and she would say to him, "I want to go back to Sarajevo," and he would tell her, "Step on my foot and you will find yourself in front of the Maghribia mosque." That's supposedly the oldest mosque in Sarajevo. So every night she would step on her foot, and it was a kind of story of teleportation, of which many people in Sarajevo dreamt of during the war, when they were living when being hunted with snipers like animals. This is a story of a bird, two birds in the same nest in the village of Ahmetci, where 116 Muslim inhabitants were killed in a single day by the Croat forces that raided the city or the village. And the imam was crucified at the door of the mosque, and the destruction and also this killing was so, of neighbors really doing this to their own neighbors, was so heavy and traumatic that after the war, when the community split over the dilemma what to do with this mosque, whether to reconstruct as if nothing happened, because many didn't want to be reminded on what had happened, and the others said, no, we have to build a marker, and we have to set some sign that this cannot be forgotten. And so for a long time there was really like a fight in this community, and it split because of that. This is a bird with a long neck, a story of a mosque that was just only a little shelled, the minaret, but then in the process of reconstruction, the Muslims from that city used the opportunity to basically express their defiance to the people who destroyed this mosque, and kind of rebuilt the minaret twice as high as it was, and also kind of providing some reference to glorious Ottoman past, that showing also kind of historical validity and claims to the land. So there's some kind of also nationalism expression coming out here. And then this is a story of a mosque in Zvornik that is the only mosque that was restored in the city. All mosques in the city were destroyed, and again also the foundation stones dug out, garbage piles or parking lots or buildings built on top of these empty lots, so that you cannot rebuild there. And they had a lot of struggle, like returning and kind of trying to rebuild this one. And this is pigs probiotics, because in the process of restoration they threw them a slaughtered pig into the foundation stones to basically humiliate the place, because eating pig is a kind of impure animal in Islamic tradition. Eating pig is forbidden to Muslims for also dietary reasons, but this is also symbolic really to show you are not welcome here. This is now our land, so don't come back. So again, this weaving as recovery, I also had to kind of work with these women they taught me a little bit of weaving so that the pattern could actually be created, because not every type of form works with the mathematics of weaving. And then finally, the carpet was meant to be displayed at the criminal tribunal in The Hague, and but then, like a week before the exhibition, Karadzic got arrested, and so safety measures and also the politics of this whole in the city has changed, and I didn't want my project to be dragged too much into that. So we exhibited it at the gallery, but then I invited the judges and the lawyers, people invested in this kind of recovering of the truth, to come, and then the prayer beads were then used as in a kind of ritual performance to hanging of this, attaching of the prayer beads on the floor on the fringes of the carpet ritually launches this project as a monument. But the monument is, so to say, waiting to be displayed in the criminal tribunal, and it's also open-ended. It's not finished, so that new stories can be woven onto also stories of churches and many other structures that have been destroyed and whose stories need to be told. This is, so to say, just the beginning. So now we are coming from this mosque, the conflicts in Bosnia, to parallel conflicts that also affect us here in the West. And for having been living in different places, I have also been confronted with the conflicts over visibility and presence of Muslims in the West, and particularly the kinds of protests we have every time a new Islamic structure is about to get built, at least in the German-speaking areas of Europe. So in reaction to these, and the institutions like Cities Against Islamization, founded in 2008 by different Western European politicians, I created this piece, Cultural Transfers, that is proposing to kind of expand this protest grammar of anti-mosque protest to include other symbols towards a more pluralistic but also more critical self-reflection, and talking about different issues related to this visibility of Muslims in the West. But also questioning what are these warning signs, I should be really alarmed that we have protests against immigrants and against mosques. A lot of these debates, as you know, are carried out in the space of architecture and also in the space of the body. So these are the media for my work. Some of these debates over mosques and kind of that are packaged in architecture often carried about, arguments you will hear, well, you cannot build your mosque here, this is not fitting in our landscape, this alien to our culture, as if Islamic culture has never been part of the European, say, cultural heritage, and which is not true, of course. We have monuments from both Ottoman Empire, but also Umayyad since centuries. And the other debate is really to say, well, this is alien, and you need to kind of build these kinds of structures that are more modern looking, that are more aligned with like what is in the environment. But there also the question is, can really Muslims relate to these structures? What is in there that they can kind of recognize their own identity in it? So this kind of dichotomy that is dominating architectural discussions prompted me to really go to the grounds of the mosque and re-examine how it has been historically defined, has it been defined, and also religiously. So neither in the Quran nor in the Hadith you have a kind of formal description of the mosque that would say this is exactly how it has to look. The Prophet Muhammad defined the mosque as the entire world, and also basically, so where you pray, that is the mosque. And if the whole world can become a mosque, that means this world includes also non-Muslims with which Muslims coexist. So there are different negotiations can happen in that space of the mosque. the first mosque, which was the house of the Prophet in Medina, was also a multifunctional space. It was not just a space for worship, but it was the house of the Prophet. He lived there with his family. It was also the seat of the first Islamic society, their government. So it had also a public space. It had this open courtyard. And this model was, as Islam was spreading over Arab Peninsula, but also other regions, was then kind of copied, but also expanded in hybridization with pre-existing architectures that Muslims found in these new places. So you cannot really talk about a specific typology of the mosque as a singular type. There's really a tremendous diversity of forms and styles as they evolved in dialogue always with local architectural languages. They found that very interesting, so that in this very concept provided by the Prophet, this world as a mosque, you have a quite elastic understanding of the space. And in my academic writing, I wrote a little theory of the mosque, defining that space not through architectural kind of shapes, but as a conceptual space that is defined by 5 conceptual spatial parameters. One is the intention of directionality. So as you see here, this image of people worshiping on the street of New York, they are all oriented towards Mecca, and it's really the orientation of their body to Mecca that kind of transforms this space of the street into a mosque. Another rule is kind of purity and cleanliness. The space where you worship has to be spiritually but also physically clean, meaning you cannot pray on toilets and graveyards. And also these people here are using carpets to kind of to provide clean surface where the face touches the ground. Minimal volume is the kind of space that your body occupies while performing the prayer. Programmatical variability, meaning that the mosque is not just a religious space, but it can switch and have different functions. And it's a temporal space also, can be, that, so to say, while these people are praying, the street becomes the mosque, this volume of their body becomes the mosque. When they stop praying, it's the street again. Or maybe it's both simultaneously. And so, based on these principles, I played with a number of different forms. This is, for example, the so-called survival mosque that I developed in response to the threats that Muslims have received in America, particularly in response to September 11, and women who are recognized as Muslims with the veil kind of were forced to retrieve to private arena. And there is a carpet that is attached to this dress that signalizes patriotism. It has water to wash yourself for ritual washing, but also to wash the spit down when you get spit on. And earplugs against insults, communication devices, educational devices, and then weapons such as American Constitution, amulets, and at that time President Bush's speech on tolerance, which is powered by photovoltaic cells. And then I added some more stuff here, like camera that watches your back and projects here. There's a satellite and a gas mask recommended by Homeland Security Department. And so this defensive system becomes completely ridiculous, of course. So no one would wear this, so you have to camouflage it into bags. And now and then they spread paranoia spreading messages, but also can become muezzin and call for prayer at the time for worship. They have Bluetooth. So when 2 Muslims are close to each other, they start beeping and signal kind of community proximity, and everyone gets connected, and this is like large network that then again can be spied on by hacking the satellite. So this was really just a kind of series of scenarios to visualize some of these stories, but I never realized this and came more with the functional dimension. This is what came to me as an idea to kind of transform clothing that will signal one's identity, with prayer racks that have devices here for orientation, a Qibla compass, and they can be transformed into bags. The front part of your pants becomes a place for prayer, but because mosque is a social space, you can unfold the back so the next one can pray behind you, like this one. And also on the side, this can go endlessly, so to say, to really create the kind of mosque as a congregation made by people. And then what I ended up producing is these prototypes that this is a female suit that the pants unfold, and there's a male. So this is I'm actually wearing it, so I would like to show you the piece, how it looks and it unfolds. Maybe, Ingrid, do you mind if you're holding the, because I have to do a lot of stuff here. Thanks. So I have my bag here that has a little Qibla compass, and so I find a direction of Mecca. Looks like this. So the bag transforms, inside of the bag gets out. The bag transforms and becomes a veil. You see this. This is an older prototype. I gained some weight, so I had to redo it. And so with a couple of actions, you can take this off. So this inside is made with water-resistant material, so that you can basically transform any space into a prayable space. And then ta-da! So I have here the front part of my pants. Thank you. The front part of my pants became like a prayer rug for another person to stand next to me. Then I chose these colors, so it's really like this act of opening is kind of celebratory and empowering, maybe flashy, but the gray is also standing for modesty and kind of being being modest. And then I have these prayer beads that people use when they finish the prayer. They repeat, like God is the greatest, and different mantras, so to say, to get out of the prayer. And I have 2 of these so that the neighbor can also use them. And then when I'm finished, I, put it back together. And this is partly very nice because I don't really, use this in a way for prayer, but when I tested it with different people, they start helping me put it on, and that becomes also a nice social act. So I'll be doing this subtly in the back because I want to show you some other projects. We have a little bit more time. So there are different iterations of this. So this started in the US. So this is Diandol Moshe that I developed in response to a site where I was artist in resident in Austria, where people really are very fond of their tradition and are still walking in these Diandols. This is the Austrian traditional costume. And there's a famous Renaissance altar in the Church of St. Wolfgang that unfolds into like 3 pieces, and I created a wearable mosque that the apron transforms into 3 prayer spaces. So what is, there are local souvenirs here attached to this, and this was kind of interesting moment where I used, so to say, local souvenirs, these little Swiss knives and ropes for alpine hiking, which is really the identity of this place. But of course, this is a point where everyone is, point of contestation. Why are weapons on this thing? And it's in that sense, the work really functions as a mirror of, seeing what people actually see. Is it the threat? Is it something you are including native, locally available materials? and symbols. What are you doing with them? This is the frontier vest that I designed in response to a place where I was in a checkpoint between Ramallah and East Jerusalem. It's a jacket, any kind of jacket that opens in the front is called frontier vest. But it's a sports jacket that can unfold into Islamic prayer rug and also a Jewish talit prayer shawl. So the hat opens, here becomes a kind of kippah. And these are some of my Middle Eastern, American, Muslim, Jewish, secular friends. It's a big yes. So it's also interesting here reading, you know, this in the context of the US, you would, or Canada, you would think, well, young people in sports jackets. If you read it in Israel, it could be a refugee, a suicide bomber, a young soldier. The reading is really also invested by the context. And finally, the last piece shows the architectural dimension, where I'm really working in the real architectural space. The Islamic cemetery Al-Tah that just won the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2013. The architect is Bernard Abada, and I designed the interior of the prayer space. This was a project of collaboration of 96 communities, Muslims, immigrants from Turkey, Bosnia, Chechnya, North Africa, who live in Vorarlberg region. This is in Al-Tah, a small town in Western Austria. They came in the 60s, always thought they're going to go back where they came from, and then they decided to stay. And now the process of pluralization is coming, basically, is happening, and the decision to create a cemetery that would unite all these people and will be a common ground for all of them was like testimony to that fact, that they are, you know, found new homeland. I responded to this idea of homeland, that homeland is not anymore the place where you came from, but where you want to be buried, with a design of the interior space that would talk to different cultures with material references and also forms. For example, here, this is the so-called mihrab or Qibla wall. This is the wall facing Mecca. And you have calligraphy that is made of wooden shingles that stand for local Austrian tradition. They have a very strong tradition of woodcraft there. And these shingles, though, are oriented towards Mecca. So as you walk in, you see, you walk in from the side, you see like a forest of these shingles. As you walk through the space, they start shivering because of the way you move. And then when you stand in the position to look towards Mecca and for the worship, the image stands still, and then you can read also the calligraphic inscription, Allah and Muhammad. There are 6 prayer rows here, also woven by these women from Bosnia with whom I collaborated earlier, so we wanted also to support that initiative. And it's really, this project is what it did in Austria, and why it got this award was that it helped, on the one hand, crystallize organizational structures of Muslims in that region, because before that there were just these communities scattered all around. Unite also different Muslim immigrants, because sometimes, you know, you had Alevis and Sunnis working here together and being buried, even though these two fractions don't, like Sunnis don't consider Alevis Muslims. And so, or at least these people don't. And so, you know, that had to be negotiated and in a common project. Catholic Church was very supportive of the project. The project was initiated by a Jewish historian, history historian, and former director of the Jewish Museum in the region. And so you have really this like a kind of collaborative effort happening here. And then what we ended up is a proposal for a new aesthetic that is both Islamic, European, but also Austrian, and very unique in that sense, and that signals a kind of unity and convergence without becoming the same, but also like finding together a common ground and being united in death, where we all hopefully are the same. Finally, thank you.
questions? Or
Sorry, just have to gather my. This is very warm suit. Good for Canadian climate.
Yeah.
so, questions?
I have one. So Montreal's landscape is really full of spires, which is spatial memory of their Catholic-dominated society. But since the 1960s and the Quiet Revolution, the population was more secular. So I was just curious, like, how you think that old architecture still informs the cultural reality of, and how that kind of compares to Bosnia.
Well, I mean, these monuments that we have, I mean, everywhere, they are just kind of a witness of a history of a place. So it doesn't mean that, you know, everyone here is Catholic now, but if you have these churches here, we'll talk about that what has been here. And I can imagine also that as society is changing and kind of attitudes towards religion, that these places also become space of contestation and place of debate, what will happen with them also if no one is using them. I mean, these are kind of discussions that are happening in many different places. In Bosnia, I think, I mean, given that history, recent history of war and that ongoing conflict, it's very heavily debated and a kind of controversial issue, these religious buildings. People, and I don't know the local debate here, so I'm gonna like go more to the Bosnian side that I know, but people react really aggressively for or against them. So it's really this polarization of the debate that that you have religious people and people who are kind of neo-religious. You know, they in the communist time, the religious was suppressed and seen as something backward. If you were religious, you had to hide it. And this was a way of oppressing also kind of nationalism that was connected with religion. You have a strong resurfacing of that happening now, and that nationalist struggle is carried mainly through religious symbols, but also language. I mean, we have kind of distinctions now in language. I mean, the topic is so touchy that I don't know. I just saw actually there was an article published here by one of your colleagues that in announcement of this lecture, and it was translated on the Bosnian portals. And I was reading some of the comments. I mean, mostly these comments are always horrible, but you could really see this like, yes, Bosnian girl, go, or what is this bitch doing? You know, I mean, this really horrible kind of a split between, yeah, and also where my own work gets instrumentalized into this or this action. That's why for me, I decided, you know, to move more in the artistic realm, academic as well. I mean, you cannot, of course, prevent instrumentalization, but I use these things not to kind of proclaim some religious missionarism here and convert you to Islam, but to talk about, pose questions. You know, this is, and what is it that we are afraid of? To show, for example, something like this, that a Muslim woman can be chic, she can be a professional. Muslims are, you know, not the monolithic structure of Islam is coming to Canada, but it's a, you know, it's a bunch of like thousands of different individuals who have diametrically opposite maybe worldviews. They come from different backgrounds, they have different professions, educational levels, social structures. So, and so this kind of work tries to just point that out and deconstruct the stereotypes in a kind of friendly but provocative way. And the critique works though in two directions. So, you know, it's a negotiation that happens for me. I get invited sometimes in churches or synagogues or in schools where they do some religious education, or political events, or with Muslim communities where it's about position of a woman, or generally, you know, like what is it, who we are, contemporary Muslims in the West. And so this kind of touches on many different, also different types of inelasticities that people may have also of their own tradition that are historically not justifiable, because really when we look at the history of Islamic architecture, there is such a richness, diversity and hybridity that also the very term Islamic architecture or art is a Western term that came from Western art history and to kind of signify art and material production from the region. But you know, scholars are debating, what is it really? Do we talk about Christian architecture in the same sense? I mean, is a high-rise in Saudi Arabia Islamic architecture? What makes it Islamic? So, I mean, these are very interesting questions. And this is not to, you know, we just need to, like, so to say, address these issues. It was a long answer. You have to interrupt me. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting and funny as well, which is great. I just had two questions. The first question, just a short question, in the sense that you mentioned the different structures that were targeted, and you mentioned two Christian, two types of Christian churches and then mosques. And I'm just wondering whether synagogues were also targeted, because I think there are Jewish communities in Bosnia. That would be my first question, very short. The other question is, I'm not quite clear on what the political debate surrounding the museum as institution is really about. What are the problems? Because there seems to be such an eagerness to sort of, reconstruct religious buildings as a kind of statement. So what is the sort of conflict that's happening within the museum in terms of the link between nationalism, identity, and so on? If you could clarify that, that would be great.
Sure. So, yeah, synagogue, I mean, there were not many synagogues left, so and they are not used as such, so they were shelled in Sarajevo also like any other building, but I mean, there were not so many structures, so it was really mainly actually Islamic sites, like the majority, but yeah, as I said, like the percentages, and these are debated numbers, so I have mainly looked at the Islamic numbers. There are some studies that were conducted by independent researchers, and all have this huge disproportion in terms of numbers, but the numbers are going to be fought over. So what happens now after the war is that people are also kind of like, they will declare also very little destroyed buildings. It's like totally destroyed, you know, because they also want to get money for reconstructions, or to be able to also express their nationalism partly, because they'll just destroy a historic building and then make a huge mosque or church on top of it. So there is also general lack of understanding of historical value of some of these objects, and this, you know, affects every community. But the conflict is really about, well, when it comes to the museum, like, because nationalism is predominant and it's carried out through these symbols that are kind of national/religious. So there is commission to preserve cultural monuments, and people are really mainly aware of, like, whatever is their national culture, they'll go for it. There is money for that. There is also money for festival culture. So you have a very successful films festival, theater festival, jazz festival in Sarajevo. For them it's easier to get sponsorship, also corporate. The problem is with this so-called state culture. So kind of heritage, like institutions like an archive or library or a museum that really depends on state infrastructure and kind of funding sources for that. And in Bosnia, the state doesn't really exist. So you have a state that has political entities and groups that have conflicting claims with the umbrella of the state. So you have people who are saying, no, this is not my state. I have my own state. So the institution, such as a national museum, stands for this common umbrella. Plus, the country doesn't have a common cultural ministry that is standing for all people in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And they also don't have support because, I mean, they are really old structures. They have people there haven't been receiving salaries for 17 years, no funds for development. So of course there are like problems with program that they offer. There's corruption. There is also, you know, not like, there are different issues basically. So partly there are personal things, like I don't like this director, so they don't want to support. So they have very little support also within local intellectuals. But the fact is, regardless how maybe dysfunctional these institutions are, there is stuff in them. There is heritage in them that belongs to all citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that is really precious stuff. And of course, you know, for our platform, the idea is not to preserve these museums as they are. They have also their underlying power structures. I mean, this is colonial history of Habsburg Empire. So it's a little weird actually as an artist, given the history of institutional critique, to kind of defend the museum. But in this case it makes sense because it's a fight for a kind of collective vision of that country. So a country that needs to have a common heritage that's not just like this ethnic group or this ethnic group. Let's have an institution that stands for all people and protect us. And so this is what is about for us, and then the hope is really to create a dialogue. But what is the modality of a possible future museum, that could be, that's up for debate, and should be also, I think, rethought. Funding models as well.
Okay, that's what I'd understood, that the debate was really about how to live together, which is quite interesting, you know, in terms of collections. There's a similar debate going on as in museums here.
No. This is this like negotiation of what is heritage.
Yeah.
There's a question over there.
I have a question about you practice sometimes as an architect, it seems like, with this last project, but for the most part not as an architect any longer. Am I right in that interpretation?
Yeah.
My question is how, especially with this sort of like memorialization of these buildings that have been destroyed or erased, what's your personal definition of architecture, and what is an architecture once the physicality of it has been sort of cleared from the earth, the way that a lot of those buildings had? And how does it manifest itself in new projects that you're constructing?
That's a very nice question. Well, I mean, it's hard to give a definition of architecture, but at least, for example, for these buildings, what is it about this? Okay, there is a kind of embodied memory of a culture, of a group that has lived there. And then architecture, because it's also a collective practice, you need a bunch of people to collaborate, share skills, work together, someone who funds that. It's also like talks about the history of a collective and or collaboration. The way we design things and where we place them also talks about kind of, it ties a memory of that collaboration tradition to a specific territory. So it's architecture, you can say, is also proof of a historical claim of a certain group. When we talk about kind of community architecture, such as religious buildings, their attachment to a land, and then it's a social process. So what is really, I mean, I defined architecture there more broadly when I looked at these mosques and rebuilding, kind of funding flows. You have Saudi Arabia missionarizing, Turkey missionarizing Bosnia. You have diasporic communities building websites where they collect funds to restore their mosques. But it's really also community kind of touching base with the people who are in Bosnia. So that's also architecture. I mean, this whole kind of social structure of that. And so I think it's a kind of space of negotiation of many different things. So for me, particularly with this last project, that was also what it was about this negotiation. So what happened with the Islamic cemetery is that it's really like a pedagogical device, what this cemetery. It speaks mainly to actually non-Muslim population. At the opening we had more than 1,000 people, non-Muslims, who came with buses, bicycles. It was crazy. We organized like architectural tours, counting with some 50 people who normally come to these openings. 1,000. So we had to split in groups. We didn't know how to accommodate all this. And they came because the aesthetic was appealing to them also, and that materiality I think is very important there. There's a certain like level of like material and form that is maybe, it's just like Islamic without necessarily having a dome and minaret here. Okay, there's some calligraphy, but the other stuff, like the way this space deals with light, is very Islamic and spiritual. It puts you in a different mindset when you walk in. The carpet is so soft. You immediately, like, it just completely transforms people and kind of disarms any prejudice that they have. But what we do now in there, and the mayor of that city, who is a non-Muslim Austrian, is very proud. This was a very important political project. He does now tours. He has given more than 60 tours. There is a kind of cemetery tourism, and now with the award, I think it's going to become more. The award is a $1 million award that goes to 5 projects. We get 200,000. Of these, 100,000 goes to different programs that we need to come up with to develop the mission that the project has created, like coexistence in this case, and this cultural convergence. So we'll do lecture series, some organizational structures for Muslims, and kind of cultural programs, language learning, and things like this. It's less, and that's going to take some time. It's less accepted by the Muslims. I mean, for them, they just wanted to have a kind of space where they can get buried. They didn't think too much about the symbolic aspects of this. So the educational part works less with Muslims, but for them, it's still this process of, where am I gonna get buried? What is homeland? And so the older generation still goes, wants to be shipped back to Turkey or Bosnia, and the young ones, they want to be buried here. And that's a process, also. So architecture is a process, social process. It was very interesting. We had no negative, there was no protest, nothing. But it took 9 years to complete this from the idea to opening, because of there was intense mediation process, and then PR, and it was like actually an educational project for the whole region.
Okay, hi. I'd like to ask if you could pick one of your works and specifically make transparent your process, how you conceptualize the work and the research behind it and your working process. Basically, I'd like to know how you think. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, so for example, this wearable stuff, the survival mask that I showed was a thinking process for this. So at first there was, I don't know actually why I came, but I guess it was, I was just personally affected being a Muslim woman living in the West by constantly having to explain myself. Why am I affiliated with either being Eastern European in Austria as a kind of second-class citizen, or as a Muslim or unveiled Muslim woman. I mean, there's a lot of explaining needed depending who you talk to. So that's, I think, how I started dealing with this. But with research, it was really it was fascinating to discover you have this very intense debate on forms, and then you discover, well, actually, there is no formal definition. Why are we so stuck with this kind of, and so, going back, I mean, it was again, this academic research, I basically worked on mosque history for 5 years, reading a lot of historical material, writing original documents, and then writing this theory of the mosque. And then once it became clear to me, and that's a Quranic concept also, that the body is the minimal sacred space, then I was like, yeah, let's solve the thing. So And then, of course, you know, the projects always evolve. So as I made the first one, first I was thinking of it as a uniform. These were the first photomontages. But then, you know, how does this actually deal with the idea of Islam is monolithic? It still reflects, like, if you make a uniform, you still represent everyone as the same. So it's, okay, this needs to be site-specific, person-specific, you know. And that's when it, then other things open up now. And that's why it's not finished, you know. So people are offering to buy the mosque. And so now the question is, what happens if you develop this in the product? Is it still going to do the same type of like work? In the kind of from Islamic history perspective, there wouldn't be a contradiction to have a kind of economic aspect in the mosque. They traditionally had businesses that would fund the mosque. But in this case, you know, it would need to have some kind of, I guess, humanitarian aspect, that who is producing it, maybe it benefiting some unemployed women, or maybe it works in an educational way. So that's, for example, an opportunity to develop this further. Where it's really interesting, where it gets kind of misunderstood, when I presented in political context. So once I was invited by a Green Party in Austria to address the debate on like Muslims in Austria. And they also announced the lectures like wearing instead of minaret. So suggesting that I'm proposing a kind of solution to the Austrian mosque problem. And then in the audience were like old conservative Muslim men who were irritated by like a young woman not being veiled. Then you had a kind of old irritated Austrian men who were generally irritated by the, yeah. And so it was really difficult, and these people were not, you know, I became more cautious who is actually the audience I speak to, because this was not read as a question or conversation starter. It was this like, great, Azra Akšamija said we don't have to build mosques, we can wear them. So they can become really invisible. And now and then these misinterpretations or kind of misuses also happen, but I said to myself, I'll accept it, you know, there's nothing I can do about it. If someone wants to misuse it, they'll do it anyway. So still, like, when, for example, when something gets published in a wrong way, then I can react that there was a lawsuit that we won in one case against a right-wing party who misused my words and like just reshuffled the quotes in a way that was completely saying the diametrically opposite of what I said. Things of this happen. I try to deal with them constructively and make new artwork out of them.
Thank you.
I'm just curious to know what are your position, or if you can comment on what the architect Ramco calls the Western morbid dedication to preservation, mostly in the West, in terms of the maintenance of historic buildings that are often misused and lose the kind of authenticity and respect for the past.
I'm not familiar with the text, what he meant with it, but maybe just about the dilemma with preservation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a certain dilemma and the kind of need to preserve and to kind of obsession with heritage is quite a modern phenomenon. It's something that we came, and that really goes also hand in hand how we define ourselves as modern nations, where heritage matters as a justification of our past, and like how far we define our national identity, this imaginary community and its constructs that are quite randomly chosen in history. Most nations take some medieval king and, oh, this is our grand past. Why don't you take pre that, you know? I mean, the question is really how far do you go in history to define yourself? So I think this question of heritage and governance is it's a kind of modern thing, and maybe you can explain in the context of that text and what he meant by the.
But you're just saying that basically we are, you know, having this kind of concern about preserving monuments that are, in your case, the monuments that are destroyed, or you're trying to preserve a utility in the religious purposes, but when they are taken out of their original context, they become more like almost like a tourist industry that's taken up by capitalism, and it's taken totally out of context. I don't know if you.
And also, I mean, the question like, who is allowed to preserve? Do you remember when this Cecilia Gimenez, the elderly lady who repainted the Jesus fresco in Spain? I love that one. And I found it so horrible when everyone was laughing about her, because what she did was really pose this question like, who said I cannot like repaint my Jesus? I mean, it's my church, I'm a painter. You know, why is someone else more qualified? And like, how did we get to that point that she cannot? And so in my future heritage collection, I have her also as a reference. It's like, who is allowed to restore heritage? Also, when we take things out of context, I mean, really, like how long, it has to do with our broader thinking of how do we define ourselves in time. When you think about it, and the Egyptians were very interesting in that sense that they thought of themselves, they were the first to think of themselves in these like long terms. They wanted to be not just for the pharaoh and kind of this world after, but of themselves, really thinking, I want to matter in 1,000 years. And I mean, the way we live, we don't really think that way in many cases, like the way we build and the way we behave with this earth and resources. At the same time, you know, some historical artifacts matter, but what happens if we have to take out, if we have to make space for water purification and food preparation that will happen in the future, and overpopulation? How will we decide what to kind of erase or not? I mean, these are questions that are just negotiated with every generation, and you see also how things lose meaning when new political system comes. These monuments don't matter anymore. In our own region, this very interesting series of monuments that were built by the Yugoslav sculptors for the like revolution, glorification, and of the Yugoslav also history. They just stand as a completely alien structures in landscape. They're very interesting sculpturally, but they have no more meaning as a site of pilgrimage where people used to go and kind of reenact that certain history and keep it alive. So, thank you.
Are there any other questions for? If not, maybe we can join us upstairs in 407 for a reception. I'd like to thank Azra very much for really helping.